I now would like to turn to introducing Amor Towles, who is both an author and will be our interviewer tonight. Amor has been in the book festival in 2011 for his book, Rules of Civility, which is a wonderful book. It's for sale back there too. He has a new book coming out, A Gentleman in Moscow, which will be out in September. He both lives in New York City and on the island. I think he was an investment banker, something like that, in finance. Wrote a novel in his spare time, got it published, quit being a banker, and is now a full-time writer, spending part of his summers here. So I'm delighted to introduce him, to introduce Richard, and then Amor will interview Richard.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Sue Ellen. Thank you for having me. Richard Russo was raised in Gloversville, New York, which is a small working-class town in upstate. And he was educated at University of Arizona, where he got his BA, his MFA, and his PhD. Became an educator. And then we, as a populace, became lucky when he turned his attention more closely to the writing of fiction. I think he had his first book published in his late 30s. I think, maybe, is that right? Or mid-30s, something like that. But since then, we've all had the benefit of 8 novels, 2 collections of short stories, a variety of screen-based work. And among those, of course, Empire Falls, which he won the Pulitzer Prize for, one of the greatest achievements in fiction writing in the country. In 1993, he came out with a novel, which I assume many of you know, if not all of you, called Nobody's Fool. And in this book, we were introduced to a working-class town, sort of a beleaguered working-class town in New York called North Bath. And we were introduced to an extraordinary cast of characters. And most importantly, I think, we were introduced to really one of the great heroes of post-war American fiction, and I really mean that, in Donald Sully Sullivan. It's just such an extraordinary invention, so unpredictable, so full of life, so resilient and humorous as an individual, and a great person to follow. Well, 13 years later, Mr. Russo turned his attention back to North Bath, and this summer, we have with us Everybody's Fool. Sequel is kind of a funny word. Kind of that sort of suggests to me that it's directly following the events of the previous, and in a way, that does a disservice to what this book is. It's a standalone achievement, but we, as readers, get the benefit of recognizing the locations and the people of whom we had become quite fond. Rick has said that in his work, he likes to investigate where the hilarious meets I'm forgetting the word, the heartbreaking, of course. And I think that's an excellent description for one of his real singular achievements, is that in his books, there are scenes where the hilarious and the heartbreaking are unfolding side by side in real time. And that is certainly true of Nobody's Fool. It is true of Everybody's Fool. And I would like to add to that both books and his work in general, the novels are also elegant, artful, and in a way, most importantly, humane. It's my great honor to have the chance to bring Rick Russo up so that I can ask him a bunch of questions. Please come on up. Thank you for coming.
Wonderful to be here.
So, I actually want to start this conversation, if it's all right, in Gloversville, so not in North Bath. And kind of looking at this town, which was a part of your youth, my understanding is that in the first half of the 20th century, Gloversville made 90% of the gloves in America, thus the name. Before that, it was actually called Stump City because of all the trees that had been cut down and the stumps that had been left behind, which strikes me as a very Rick Russo sort of history. But 80% of the population in Gloversville worked in the tanneries and in the sewing mills to make these gloves. After 1950, gloves fell out of fashion, and what you ended up with is 5 decades of population decline in this town. So that brief little synopsis to me, it's already familiar. We've all been to towns like this throughout the Northeast, in the Midwest, but it certainly feels aspects of that like North Bath. So I want to ask you about to what degree Gloversville influenced you in the creation of North Bath and in your interest in those types of towns that are in America.
I've said elsewhere, probably in my memoir, I never can remember where I've said things or written them exactly, but somewhere along the line I wrote that the town that I grew up in, look back at it now and it just seems like the canary in the mine shaft. First of all, thank you all so much for coming tonight. I understand there's a political convention going on that some of you may have some interest in, so it's very good of you to come. Very good of you to come tonight. But a lot of the issues that we're talking about now, that are kind of front and center in this election, work, the loss of jobs, and so many other things. I look at it. I see these things coming into focus now, kind of in the national imagination, in 2016. And what I would like to tell so many people is, geez, you just should have been there in Gloversville in 1959, because it was all happening. It was all happening. And in 1959, the thing about it is when you're right in the middle of it, it doesn't feel looking back, you saw what happened, but when you're right in the middle of it, it doesn't seem like anything momentous is happening. But when I was growing up as a kid in Gloversville in the late 50s, despite the fact that it was clear that the glove industry was not then what it was before the Second World War, when, as you said, 90% at least of the dress gloves made in America were made in Gloversville. Every year the numbers were going down. Every year more and more of glove making was being outsourced to sometimes to India, sometimes to Indonesia, various places. As a result of that, wages were going down. There was a steady pressure, wages going down, more emphasis on productivity, more emphasis on looking the other way. When it came to safety and in the various tanneries and glove shops. And if you look at it through the lens of history from 2016, you kind of want to say, well, surely you must have seen what was coming. But when you're right in the middle of it, and every year you see a little bit more loss and a little bit more loss and a little bit more loss, you kind of trick yourself into thinking that, all right, we're just in a cycle here, and maybe something will happen to turn things around, and maybe some of these jobs will come back, and maybe wages will start to go up again. And it's only in historical retrospect you look at this and you think, no, of course, this was the end. This was the end of a way of life. And it wasn't what fascinated me so much about it was that it wasn't just the jobs. I mean, the jobs were part of it. It wasn't just the salaries, although the salaries were part of it for these hardworking people. When you take that many jobs and that much money out of a community, you also rob that community of its sense its sense of itself. You lose each one of these men and women, and there were a lot of women sewing gloves, not in the glove shops, but at home. When you start, it's not just the money. It's people's sense of themselves, their pride, the pride that comes from doing work well and producing something that is finally made. And when that happens over a period of decades, one decade after another, the loss to that community's sense of self is staggering. And in a way, it strikes me as incredibly lucky that I could have grown up in this place when I did, and especially having the parents that I had, because my father was a D-Day guy, and he went from the beaches in Normandy all the way to Berlin, and he lost a lot of friends along that path. And he and the men who survived, and the women who had kept the country going during the war, when the men returned, determined through the GI Bill and other progressive programs to get their lives back on track again, it seems to me, America was at its most optimistic. They had done this incredible thing. And so this generation of people were looking at America with this tremendous sense of hope that barriers were coming down. America was going to be a different kind of place. There would be a place in America for hardworking people. Who knows? You might get invited to the country club now. Who knows? We all came together. We all came together in this effort, and to see these extraordinarily optimistic people come home to a situation where all the evidence on the ground would not justify their optimism, my parents' generation. There was no evidence on the ground in Gloversville at that time that there was any cause really for celebration or optimism at all, and yet there they were. They still believed in that was going to happen, despite all the evidence on the ground. Well, this is just a long way of saying that for me, one of the things that it took me a long time to realize as a writer was what I was going to be writing about. What I was privileged enough to witness something taking place in the mid to late 50s and early 60s. I was watching something astonishing. A part of my own nation just changing, and in some senses disappearing, and that's what a lot of these books are about. Trying to capture that moment in our history as a nation and as a culture. This tremendous clash of post-war optimism coming up against realities that nobody knew the meaning of. Kind of a long-winded. I
like that. That's what it should be. Because your description very vivid and eloquent, and I think we all have a sense of what had happened to some degree because we've witnessed it in some town or another. Because there were many towns that went through it for a different reason.
Yeah.
My wife grew up in Lawrence, Massachusetts. It was shoes.
Yeah.
The same kind of thing. The shoes were slowly leaving town, and it was changing the face of the town. As you make that description, which is quite stark, on the other hand, we see in your books, great humor, great resiliency, loyalty, these other attributes of the human character that are almost in a way thriving, it seems like, in that environment. So I guess my question is, like humor being an example, do you think that the stress of those times in a way unleashes that humor to a greater degree? Or is that something you're bringing in as an artist to help us survive, the discussion of the times?
Well, one of the things that I will say about my parents' generation, and especially the men like my father who did survive the war, they did come home with a sense of humor, And the fact that life was hard did not discourage their sense of humor, and it, in fact, as you suggest, heightened it. They all had a pretty good sense of the absurd. And I'll share an anecdote with you because it sticks in my craw even now. I don't, our books come out, and we hope for the best. We hope that they land well. We hope that they're reviewed well.
That they're read.
That they're read. People buy them so that we can afford to write another one. All of those things, and yet I learned fairly early on that I wasn't going to be offended, or at least not mortally offended, by a bad review. If somebody doesn't like the book, they don't like the book. That's fine. And I wasn't going to get a. Who was it that said that a bad review can spoil your breakfast, but it certainly shouldn't spoil your lunch. And I've always kind of felt that way. Yeah, it registers, and yeah, you wish they'd liked it more, and all of that. But you just don't. You learn after a while, just not to take it personally. These bad reviews. But I remember when the movie of Nobody's Fool came out, which I adored. I just thought it was, and I saw it again fairly recently because the director, who has remained a great personal friend of mine over the years, Robert Benton, has just got a Lifetime Achievement Award from an international film festival, and I was asked to give it to him, and it was just a wonderful moment because that movie it just introduced me to a whole new generation of. A whole new readership out there as a result of that. But I remember that when the movie came out, it was reviewed by Roger Ebert and at the time Gene Siskel.
Gene Siskel, yeah.
And I remember that Ebert loved the movie, and I remember that Siskel was so down the nose about it. And in this case, you have to remember, he's talking now. My name never came up in the review. He's talking about Robert Benton's movie, and Benton and I had worked on it, of course, and we had just started work on another project together. But Gene Siskel, remember that kind of patrician tilt that he could have to his head, and he said that one of the flaws of the movie was that characters like Sully, who had no education, simply just didn't possess wit like that. I remember watching that at home and levitating right off my chair because he wasn't talking about me, and he wasn't talking about my book. But this guy, especially Siskel, this guy, suggesting that people who didn't have education didn't have wit, that life could not fill you with the kind of wisdom that leads to wit, was so offensive to me that I share the anecdote with you now. So many years later, I have not forgiven the prick, and I never, ever will.
That's so that if one of us runs into him in an airport,
that's
right? Is that the idea, right? You can bring it up. I would like to shift for a second to the new book, Everybody's Fool.
Yeah.
Everybody's Fool.
Yeah.
And I'd love to get you to, if you would share the sort of the anecdotal premise, because I want to talk with the garage opener. If you could, for those who have not read the book, sort of that kind of, which I don't know if it was a starting point, but it seems like it might have been one of the starting points. But
it was there. There are a couple of things that provided a kind of narrative impetus in this book, and one of them is the garage door opener. And we can tell you about this, without spoiling it, I think, for those of you who haven't even begun the book yet. But at one point, probably a decade or so ago, my wife Barbara and I were at a dinner party, and we were living at the time in Camden on the coast of Maine. And someone told a story, a true story, and I believe it's true, although I've heard several different versions of it, and the details are not always consistent. And of course, whatever the details they were, I was going to mess with them anyway and embellish. But the story that we were told was of this local cop. In some of the renditions that I hear about, he was a local cop. In others, he was the chief of police. I can't vouch for the details, but anyways, there was the story of this police officer who was in his wife's car one day and discovered a garage door remote that did not open their garage. Yeah, see, you just jumped to the same conclusion that he did, right? and that was his first thought, oh, and his second thought was, who? And he actually went around town, both the town that I was living in and other small towns up and down the coast. He was after all, a policeman. Had reason to be out and about, and went around town, sometimes walking, sometimes driving up and down the streets, just pointing the garage door open at individual garages on the premise that sooner or later he was going to find a garage door that went up and he would know who his wife's lover was. And at the time I heard the story, my first thought was, who in the world would do something so lunatic? And the first person to come to mind was Officer Raymer.
Your own character, right?
My own, my own invention,
Yeah, right.
from 23 years ago. The other instance, this book is dedicated to Howard Frank Mosher, who is a dear writer pal of mine. If you don't know his work, that's your assignment for tomorrow. Look up Howard Frank Mosher on Amazon, and then go to your local independent bookstore and buy one of his novels. But Howard, for some reason, when he read Nobody's Fool, he just rubbed Squeers, Sully's sidekick, just found a place in Howard's imagination. He really loved Rub a lot, and Sully too. And every time, over a period of like 2 decades, every time I would run into Howard, he would say, "What's new with Sully and Rub?" This is years now, 15 years after the book had come out. And he always used to say it as if they were real people, and as if I had Skyped with them, just earlier, and I had news to report, and of course I never did. I don't think about my books after they're published, unless I have to write the screenplay or something. I don't generally revisit them. But Howard, without fail, every time would say, "What's new? What's up with Rub?" And I never had, until, of course, the motto or the lesson to be learned from both of these anecdotes is be careful what you say around writers. Because my wife and I were out somewhere else, probably another dinner party. Somewhere I heard a story about a guy who was supposed to trim a tree limb, which was when the wind blew, was scratching against his wife's window, and she'd been badgering him to do it. Yeah, I'll do it. And finally said, this time he made a solemn promise, it'll be done by the time you get home from work. And the night before, he had called a friend to come over and help him do this. Well, the friend doesn't show up. And he just can't face his wife that night. And so he does, he goes down into the basement and gets the chainsaw and a length of rope. And he ties one end of the rope to the handle of the chainsaw and the other end of the rope to his belt. And he begins to climb. Oh, now I've done it. he begins to climb up into the chainsaw until he gets about 30 feet up into the tree. Second story window is right there, and he sits on the limb that he means. I know. that he means to lop off. Now he is sitting, and he's not that stupid. He is sitting with his back to the trunk, right? You have to kind of imagine. So anyway, there he is sitting with his back to the trunk of the tree. He pulls up the chainsaw, starts the chainsaw, spreads his legs as best he can, and the limb falls. The limb falls to the ground. He's now sitting on this nub of a tree limb. He lowers the chainsaw down to the ground and unties it from his belt, tosses it down, and only then begins to consider where he is, reaching from a sitting position. The next limb up is too high. He can't reach the next limb down without tipping over. And of course, if the limb that he just sewed off was there, he could grab onto that and reach down. But of course, that limb is gone, so he can't. Nor can he rotate on it, because for that you would need the limb also. And so with the limb on the ground and the chainsaw and the rope and everything else down there, and it's now 10:30 in the morning, and his wife gets off work at 5, he has really the rest of the afternoon to contemplate what he has done. And when I heard this story, I thought, who in the world would do such a thing? And Rub Squeers came to mind, and the next time I saw Howard, he said, "What's new with Rub?" and I told him that story just as it was told to me, except I told him
as if Rub
I
did
told
it,
him
yeah.
as if it were news from Rub. I had just gotten off the phone with Rub, and he had told me this story, and of course it was Sully who finds him in the tree, and and all of that. So yeah, somebody was asking me the other day with regard to this book, do you make this shit up? You know. And yeah, some of it, yeah.
Because part of the reason I was interested in the fact that the garage door opener came out of an anecdote you had heard.
Yep.
You know, this
Yep.
anecdote you heard is some of my favorite writing in both of the novels are the sequences that take place in the bar or the diner. Mm-hmm. You know, the White Horse or Hattie's. There's something about it just where, and it's particularly maybe in looking at a small town or a smaller town, that you just see all the life kind of popping up at the bar or in the diner. The humor, the rivalries, the secrets, it's all there.
Yeah.
And I read somewhere that you, at least for a phase, did your writing in a diner.
Yep.
Maybe when you were an educator, a college professor. And so my question for you is, are you an eavesdropper?
Am I an eavesdropper?
Yeah, like, you know,
no.
Have you hung out at a bar or at a diner where you end up in conversations with strangers, or the anecdotes come through your friends?
No, strangely not.
Okay.
Strangely not. I used to work in public places all the time, and probably still would now, except for cell phones, which has changed my writing process tremendously, because, you know, if there are 50 people talking around you, it all becomes ambient noise.
Right.
But have you ever noticed how one person talking on a cell phone, it just gets through? And so I've had to stop doing that. But even when I was working in public places, in diners and restaurants, which I did for almost all of my writing career until the invention of cell phones, what would happen is, really, after the first line or two of dialogue, you could shoot a gun off, you know, by the side of my head, and I would come out of my trance, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours later, really having heard nothing. So once I'm dreaming, I'm not at all aware of what's going on around me. The people on the page that I'm writing about are speaking to me. Yep. And most of that is purely invented. Every now and then I'll hear out and about, I'll hear somebody say something that I'll make a note of when I get home. But when I'm writing, when I'm working, I'm not eavesdropping. I'm
Yeah.
not eavesdropping at all.
You're letting the people, the
No.
characters speak to each other.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Going back to the two characters you mentioned, Police Chief Raymer,
Yeah.
Rub. One of the big things that stuck out for me in reading the new novel, in comparison to Nobody's Fool, is Nobody's Fool is populated with a variety of heroic, confident, witty people.
Yeah.
Miss Burrell being one, and
Yeah.
Sully being the other. The two key players. In this novel, the new novel, the early pages of the book, you actually it's the three R's. It's Raymer, Rub, and Roby,
Right.
who are really the sort of the anti-hero is too strong a word, but they are kind of the misfits of the first novel. They're not on main stage.
Right.
They all have major shortcomings as individuals in that book, and so I was kind of fascinated by. It seemed I was wondering whether or not you wanted to go back and visit those smaller, more misbegotten, forgotten characters of the first novel and put them in the spotlight when you return to the town.
Yeah, I generally don't know very much when I begin a book, but one of the things that I knew, I think, going into this book was Sully. This would not be Sully's novel the way Nobody's Fool was, and it wasn't so much because I didn't want him to be. Bringing Sully back to life was one of the most wonderful parts of writing this book. He was based on my father, so it was a lot like getting my father back for the 5 years that it took me to write the book, having more time in his company. And of course, he was played by Paul Newman in the movie, who has since died, and it was like having more of Paul's company as well. So it was that part of it was wonderful. It was a wonderful exercise. But I think Raymer and Rub and Carl Roebuck and some of the minor characters, and Ruth also, that has Ruth was cut from Ruth Sully's paramour from Nobody's Fool, was cut out of the Robert Benton film completely. There just wasn't a place for her in that. But she seemed to me to be a really significant character, and I loved those sections of this book that were about her. But I think, Amor, what it comes down to is that for a couple of things. For one of my kind of core beliefs as a novelist, and probably also as a human being, is that there are no small lives. And especially when they're yours, but there are no small lives. And sometimes when we read novels, especially works of literature, the kinds of books that you might want to read more than once, they create sometimes the kind of false impression that lives can be ranked according to their importance, right? Ahab is the most important character in Moby Dick, therefore his life is more important than the lives of the other people on the Pequod. When we read literature that really sinks in with us, one of the kind of unfortunate side effects of that is that we get the impression that David Copperfield, who is the hero, as he says in the opening paragraphs of David Copperfield, whether I will turn out to be the hero of my own story or not, these pages will tell. But of course he is, and these pages do tell. But then, of course, there's the rest of David Copperfield and all of these wonderful minor, are they minor? Well, in the scope of that novel, they're minor. They're minor characters that seem to be less important than David. But one of the thrills of reading a Dickens novel is you always kind of get the impression that he could have written a book about any of them. Right? It could have been about Mr. Micawber. It just isn't. Right. And I've always loved novels that are sequels in the sense that they bring you back to a world, and you will be reading about characters that you have met before. But it's like you've turned the kaleidoscope a little bit, and suddenly now there's a new pattern, and as a result of the new pattern, suddenly somebody who's a minor character gets to step up into that spotlight, and your first instinct is to say, "Wait a second, Raymer? No, he's just a fool. He was just a pawn in the first book. He doesn't have an inner life that could sustain that kind of one-note character. He doesn't have the kind of inner life that could sustain a novel. No, give me Sully. I know Sully, and I know I want to go back to him. Don't give me a pawn. Give me the the central character again." But that's the thing about Small Lives. When you put that spotlight on what you think of as a minor character, very often you will discover exactly the kinds of emotional depth and resonance. And one of the first things that I learned about Raymer, as he is the title character after all, he is everybody's fool in this book, is that part of the reason that he is everybody's fool is that that's what everybody has told him about himself.
Right.
And once I, as the novelist, began to understand that he was more than that, what a thrill. What a thrill that was. What a thrill that was for me to discover that this kind of one-note character from an earlier book can come back and have that kind of depth and resonance, and you get to find out what he loves and what he fears and what has tormented him through his childhood and into middle age, and I just had a new best friend.
Yeah, in the novel, there is sort of a quick glimpse at an image, which is on a hat, which is a snake consuming itself by the tail,
right?
In the shape of a circle,
right?
That sort of classic image. It's immediately stood out for me because so many of the characters in the book are their worst enemies.
Yeah.
They are constant, and like in the example you've just given, which is that Raymer isn't as dumb as he thinks. He's not as cowardly as he thinks, but somebody's told him that, and he's the one who's reinforcing that the likelihood that he's going to behave that way.
Yep.
But Sully, of course, in the first novel, is dominated by his stupid phases, where he knows he shouldn't do this next thing. He knows it.
Yeah.
And he knows it's going to make
the marrow of his bones. He knows it.
It's going to make him happy for 2 minutes and miserable for 2 years, but he's going to do it anyway.
That's right.
So, and I guess I was kind of wondering, do you think that's almost like do you think it's a human character? That's just the nature of the human character. It's human nature that we all do that to some degree, or is that a part of being kind of in the difficult times of the town that they're in?
Well, I know I do it.
Okay. Which is the most important. Right? Okay.
So it's not surprising that a lot of my characters
grapple with that.
I just identified Officer Raymer as the everybody's fool of the title, but it also applies to the author. I mean, who among us hasn't said at a given point, "Oh, this is the wrong thing to do right now," and thought with the very next breath, "Get out of my way." Because boy, is this going to be fun.
I'm going to do it for sure. Okay.
Everybody's going to remember this one for a long time.
Right.
And you're usually right. You will remember that moment for a long time. I do think there are no small lives, and I think that I just revel in those moments, whether it's Sully or Raymer or any of the characters in my novels. Those moments where our humanity is revealed in really small ways. You do something marginally stupid, and it's a small thing, but because we don't want to look stupid, the next thing you do is you try to cover up the little stupid thing that you did. And covering it up, of course, makes it worse. And pretty soon you realize that the little thing that you did that you could have just admitted to at the beginning has these just enormous consequences, and you really have no choice but to play it out, to just play out the string. Right. And it's such joy to follow people. And Mark Twain did it, and
Yes, right.
that's the essence. That's the essence of the comic vision. I think is that we are most recognizable to ourselves, not in our moments of wisdom, but in our folly. In our folly, that's where we recognize the person that we look at in the mirror every morning, first thing, before we kind of compose that face and turn it into the face that you're hoping that is the snapshot that somebody's going to make. That first face that you look at before you have a chance to compose the face that you're going to go out into the world with. That face that is so full of self-doubt and folly and all of that. That's the moment it seems to me where we most recognize ourselves and our shared humanity.
Another sort of difference, I think, between the two books, that was very striking to me, is that in the second book there's much more of a presence of malice, malevolence, danger. For the most part, in the first book, there is violence. There's domestic violence, and there's guys beating each other up in bars, but it doesn't sort of have this sharp-edged element of we feel like evil may have just come in the room.
Yep.
There are two characters in this novel where there's an ominous sense that these could be very dangerous and malevolent people, and forces of nature almost.
I was going to say three. I'm
yeah.
curious. I'm curious to which two you're talking about.
Well, I'm thinking of the snake
Roy Purdy, I'm assuming.
Yeah,
is one.
Roy Purdy and the Snake Salesman for me. But
Okay.
Yeah. And I guess I was kind of interested in that of as when you started this book, was that an intention? Did you discover that in the process? Is that in any way related to how you see the evolution of these towns or this town? What brought that force to the fore in this novel in a way that it was not as much of a presence in Nobody's Fool?
No, I think that's exactly right, and thank you for commenting on it. I think this is a much, much darker book. I think that it's a darker book because I don't want to say exactly that I am a darker human being now, but I think, let's face it, since 1992, let's think of all that's happened in the world. I think that since the attacks on the World Trade Center, certainly not limited to the attacks on the World Trade Center, but I think since the attacks on the World Trade Center, we all, not just as Americans, but as citizens of the world, have become much more aware of evil as a presence in our lives. And I consider myself to be an optimistic writer, and I consider this to be an optimistic book.
Right.
But it was harder to arrive at that optimism. It was harder because nobody wants the kind of optimism that suggests that in order to arrive at it, the author has willingly closed his eyes to the world, and to the evil, as it is present in the world. And I think that the basic reason that this book is so much darker, I hope just as funny, but so much darker in the earlier book, that in 2016, its author is 23 years older, and these last 23 years have been shaped, on the one hand, by some pretty wonderful things that have happened in my life. I never dreamed that I was going to, at this point, when I started my career, that I would have 10 books to my name, that I would have won a literary prize, that I would be able to make my living as an author, as opposed to as I was for the first half of my career as an author, but also a teacher. I have two wonderful, brilliant daughters who were kids when I was writing about them in Empire Falls, and who are now in their 30s. I am a grandparent now. In terms of my own life, I could not have imagined the blessings that have been bestowed upon me for no particular reason, it seems to me at sometimes. My life in personal terms has just, I couldn't have asked for anything more. But the world has not fared terribly well during those 20, as the world was bestowing blessings
On you, right.
On me personally.
Right.
Everybody has not been so fortunate.
Right.
The nation has not been so fortunate, which is what this election is about. The nation has not been so fortunate. As a nation, we have witnessed some truly, truly evil things. And I think that the evil that we have witnessed in the last 23 years since I wrote Nobody's Fool has found its way without my planning. I didn't say, all right, this book, because I'm writing it 23 years later and because these various things have happened to us as a nation, must be a darker book. It just was.
Yes.
Because in order for it not to be, I would have had to simply close my eyes and pretend that the world in 2016 has not changed since the writing of that earlier book, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think we open up to questions, but I would just say, while it's, all that's there, that element which is of resiliency and humor are still there too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's where it's in the first book really juxtaposed against that economic decline.
Yeah.
Here it's juxtaposed against a different force that the individuals
Yes.
have to battle. But that same, as you say, the optimism's still there, but
Yes.
it has to work harder to get to the final page, right?
It does indeed.
But please, we would love to, does anybody have a question for Rick? Yes, here.
Oh, the third evil character.
Oh,
the third evil character you won't meet until pretty close to the end of the book, actually. He's an academic.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, he's another.
I forgot about it, right?
Yeah.
Of course. Right.
He's as purely as close to pure evil as you're likely to want to get near.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Hi.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you for your wonderful novels. I'm recovering from hip surgery. I had a lot of time on my hands. And it just happened my men's book group was reading Everybody's Fool.
Uh-huh.
And we'd read some time ago Empire's Falls, but I decided, because I have all this time, I should go back and read Nobody's Fool.
Yeah.
Before I read. And of course, you read Nobody's Fool, and of course you think Sully is the title character. And maybe he is. That's my question, because you moved to Everybody's Fool, and you've already mentioned that the chief.
Right.
And of course, my reaction in reading the first chapter of Everybody's Fool is, oh my God, he's now the chief.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right,
I know.
exactly, right.
You know,
Yeah,
you know. And
Yeah.
so that's. But what struck me after reading the book was that you begin and end Everybody's Fool with the chief. He's the title character. In the first book, you begin and end the book with Ms. Burrell, I think her name is,
Right.
the teacher. And so then it dawned on me, maybe she is actually the title character. Sully's the principal, but she's clearly in some ways nobody's fool. I don't know. That's just my theory. So I was curious. I tested on you, the author.
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. I think that Sully manages to get through his days thinking that he's nobody's fool. I think and I think by the end of the book, I think by the end of the first novel, he knows that's not true. I think he thinks of himself as nobody's fool in the sense that he has seen a lot of the world as a result of the war, and he has come back and he has done a lot of different jobs, and he certainly doesn't. I mean, he considers himself to be a realist in the world. He thinks of himself as a pretty good judge of character, and I think he is a pretty good judge of character, except for himself. But I think that, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to say this, I think Miss Burrell is the kind of center, the kind of emotional center, and the wisest character in both of these novels. And of course, she's been dead 10 years before the second one begins, but she's still very much alive in the memory of the characters in this novel. But she, to my mind, whenever in either novel, I was looking for a kind of wisdom, whenever I was looking for more wisdom than I myself possessed, I looked to Miss Burrell. And I think you're right. I think she is nobody's fool in both books. And one of my favorite scenes in this one, which I won't tell you about because I don't want to ruin it for you, for those of you who haven't begun the book yet or finished it. But there is a scene in this book that could have come from the first book because it comes from the same period of time when Sully, it's a scene between Sully and Miss Burrell. It's a memory section where Sully sees her for the last time before he goes off to war. And it's one of my favorite scenes in both novels. And it's because Miss Burrell reveals herself to be so wise and so distraught at the possibility of what Sully has just determined to do. So thank you for that question. Miss Burrell, I don't know what there is about elderly women, but Miss Burrell in both of these novels, and Sister Ursula in the title story of my short story collection are, when I'm looking for somebody smarter than I am, I seem to turn to 80-year-old women. Figure it out.
Hi, thank you very much for being here.
Oh, yes, hi. Yes, Lord?
You're doing wonderfully. I'm a very recent Richard Russo convert and loving every minute of it, so it's a pleasure to hear you speak tonight. Could you share a little bit more about the experience of seeing your books transformed into film and television?
Sure. The first thing to say is how incredibly lucky I've been. And not everybody is. You can name the people who have been really lucky, I think, almost on one hand. Dennis Lehane comes to mind. I think he's had some really good film experiences, but bad things happen in that shift from novel to film. So I have been incredibly fortunate in working with. In the first movie, I think Robert Benton was really at the top of his game directing that movie. I mean, it is flawless. And I think you could teach a course in adaptation if you were teaching a course in adaptation in film school. I think you could spend a good month with students, get them to first read the novel, not because the novel is that important, but just to show the decisions that Benton took in writing that screenplay, because people continue to come up to me and they'll say, geez, what I love most about that movie is how faithful it was to the novel. And I always want to say, yes, except you should note that 3/4 of it was chopped. But in fact, that's exactly right. Benton took out 2/3 to 3/4 of that novel in order to make, I think, a brilliant movie. But what he was faithful to was Sully and that town. And so you don't miss the 3/4 of it that's gone. And I think seeing now, as I did just recently, seeing that movie again on the big screen, seeing Newman just light it up. There are things in Nobody's Fool that are in Everybody's Fool, not that I took from the early book, but that I took from Paul Newman's performance as Sully. There are things that I now understand about my fictional character that I didn't understand about it when I was writing that book, things that I now know about that character as a result of watching Paul Newman. It was astonishing. And I wouldn't, if it had been me, I wouldn't have cast him. And I wouldn't have cast Jessica Tandy either, I probably would have cast Linda Hunt, just based on the physical description that I had given. But that performance of Jessica Tandy's in it, and as they always say, no, there are no small roles, only small actors. Well, what about Philip Seymour Hoffman in his first, one of his very first small studio roles? I owe an extraordinary amount to Hoffman. Not just in that small role as Raymer, but I thought about him all the way through, even after his death, even after we learned the tragic news that he was gone. I used Philip Seymour Hoffman, my memory of him and what he did in that movie, but also in Empire Falls, playing a completely different role. But I was able to see Raymer's character more clearly in my imagination. As a result of those two phenomenal actors, they brought something to these people that their creator, their author, didn't know was there. And I think that the same thing was true with HBO's miniseries of Empire Falls. I wasn't at all sure of the casting of Ed Harris as Miles Roby, because the character that I had described was James Gandolfini, just in terms of his physical. And I thought, this is a guy that's been literally eating his mistakes for 30 years. And I don't think you can eat your mistakes literally and end up looking like Ed Harris, personally. That's my own personal opinion. But here's slim, trim Ed Harris, and that first scene between him and his daughter Tick absolutely broke my heart. And it wasn't because I was remembering the scene as I wrote it. It was because I was seeing something that those two actors brought to that role that simply was not on the page. There was a fair amount on the page, but that wasn't on the page. So, one, I just leave it at that. I have just been extraordinarily lucky to work with people who have taught me a lot about storytelling that I didn't know.
I also loved
Hi.
the movie, and we just watched it in preparation for seeing you.
Yeah.
But it worries me that there can't be a sequel of this one because the actors are gone, but
Yeah.
you want them there so much. You want to see more.
Yeah. Paramount
Is there
Pictures.
any way
Paramount
to go
Pictures.
around that?
Paramount Pictures feels the same way. By the way, we much to my chagrin, as a few months out before Everybody's Fool was published, I wrote a note to my West Coast agent saying, shouldn't we be hearing something soon? Shouldn't there, if there's going to be interest in this book, shouldn't we be hearing something by now? And he wrote back and said, well, the first thing we would have to do, of course, is to find out if Paramount is interested. And I said, well, why should that matter? And he said, well, because they own the sequel rights. And I thought, 23 years later, that hadn't occurred to me at all. I wasn't even thinking about the book necessarily as a sequel, and it's not a Harry Potter novel, for God's sake. Why should they have anything to say about it? And it's taken really until just about a week ago to get them to even read the book. And their conclusion after reading the book, and I think that they did exactly what you did. I think they went back and they watched that movie, and they said, you know what? There's no other Paul Newman. There just isn't. And they said that this was for him such an iconic role. It happened so late in his career. They just couldn't think of anybody else that they wanted to do a new movie with. They thought, who would we cast? They're gone. They're all gone. Hoffman is gone. Jessica Tandy is gone. Paul Newman is gone. I'm hoping but my hope is that what makes you discouraged in looking for another actor to reprise that role if you look at it and you say to yourself, is there another Paul Newman? The answer to that question is obviously no. But if you say to yourself, is there another great actor who could bring something new? Someone who doesn't, you're not going to try to find someone who looks like Paul Newman, I hope. So you're going to find someone probably who's a great actor and is going to find something else in that role. And he won't, whoever that is, will not be channeling Paul Newman, or should not be.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming out in the heat
Correct.
tonight. Thank you, Amor.
My pleasure.